Dr. Naomi Winters went quiet in a way I'd never once seen from her across 14 months of couples counseling, a specific, careful stillness that had nothing to do with the professional neutrality she usually maintained, and I remember thinking, watching her face in that individual session, that I had just said something that mattered considerably more than I understood in the moment I said it. I'd been describing, almost as an aside, a specific phrase my husband used whenever he wanted to end an argument without actually resolving it, something he said so consistently it had become a kind of verbal tic between us, and Dr. Winters had simply stopped writing, her pen suspended over her notepad, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that felt, for the first time in our entire professional relationship, genuinely personal rather than clinical. My name is Sabine Farrow, I'm 38 years old, and this is the story of the exact sentence that made my own therapist's face change, the thin office wall that had been quietly bleeding two separate betrayals into each other for months without either woman on either side of it understanding what she was actually hearing, and the specific, methodical unraveling that followed once I finally understood my husband hadn't simply been unfaithful, he'd been living an entire second emotional life. In the exact same building where I went to try to save our marriage. I need to explain how Callum and I ended up in couples therapy in the first place, because the specific texture of that decision matters considerably to understanding everything that followed. We'd been married 9 years, together for 12, and roughly a year before any of this began, we'd hit what I genuinely believed, at the time, was an entirely ordinary rough patch, the kind any long marriage eventually works through. Callum had grown more distant over several months, more prone to short, clipped answers when I asked about his day, and I'd suggested therapy not out of any specific suspicion but out of a general, low-grade worry that we were simply drifting the way couples sometimes do when careers and routines slowly crowd out the attention a marriage actually needs. Callum agreed almost immediately, which I remember finding reassuring at the time, a sign, I told myself, that he cared enough to do the work. Dr. Winters ran a small, well-regarded practice out of a converted Victorian house near downtown, a building she shared with 2 other independent therapists, each of them renting a separate suite with its own private entrance but sharing a common waiting area and, as I would eventually learn, walls considerably thinner than any of them fully realized. We saw her together every other week for our couples sessions, and roughly 4 months in, she'd suggested I might benefit from a handful of individual sessions as well, to work through some of my own patterns around conflict avoidance, sessions I began attending on the alternating weeks between our joint appointments. I want to describe the specific texture of those early months in therapy, because I think it matters to understanding how genuinely, sincerely I believed we were doing legitimate work together. Dr. Winters was skilled, warm without being soft, the kind of therapist who asked precise questions rather than simply nodding along, and I remember feeling, during that period, a specific kind of cautious hope, the sense that Callum and I were actually addressing something real rather than simply papering over a widening gap. He learned language in those sessions, vocabulary I noticed him picking up and using at home, phrases about using his words, instead of shutting down, about naming the feeling underneath the feeling, language that felt, at the time, like genuine progress, evidence that the process was actually working on him. It was during an individual session, roughly 8 months into our overall therapy, that everything began to shift. I was describing, somewhat idly, a specific frustration from earlier that week, an argument where Callum had, once again, used a phrase I'd heard from him dozens of times over the years whenever he wanted to shut a conversation down while appearing, on the surface, to be doing exactly the emotional work therapy encouraged. "I hear that you're upset," he'd say, "and I want to sit with that instead of reacting to it," a sentence that sounded, every single time, like genuine emotional maturity, and that I'd slowly come to understand, over years of marriage, was actually his most effective tool for ending a conversation without ever answering the actual question I'd asked. I described that specific phrase to Dr. Winters, mimicking his exact cadence without thinking much about it, and that's when she went still. I remember the specific quality of that silence, because it lasted long enough that I actually stopped talking myself, watching her face, understanding, on some instinctive level, that something had shifted in the room that had nothing to do with anything I'd actually intended to communicate. "Dr. Winters," I said, "are you okay?" She recovered quickly, professionally, telling me that phrase had simply reminded her of something from another case, a comment vague enough that I filed it away without much further thought in that moment, the way you file away most small, unexplained things in a busy life. I want to explain what happened over the following several weeks, because looking back, I understand now that Dr. Winters herself had begun, quietly and with considerable professional anguish, wrestling with an ethical question I wouldn't fully understand the shape of until much later. I noticed, over our next several sessions, a specific new carefulness in how she asked me questions, a slight hesitation before certain topics that hadn't been there previously, a pattern I attributed, at the time, to simply deepening the therapeutic work rather than to anything she might be independently, privately piecing together on her own side of the therapeutic relationship. The detail that eventually cracked this entire situation open arrived almost by accident, during a session roughly 6 weeks after that first moment of unexplained stillness. I mentioned, in passing, that Callum had started seeing his own individual therapist, something he'd told me about a few months earlier, framing it as additional, supplementary work he wanted to do alongside our couple sessions, a detail I'd found genuinely encouraging at the time, more evidence that he was taking our marriage's repair seriously. I mentioned, almost as an aside, that his appointments happened to be at the same office building as ours, since he'd told me it was convenient to schedule around his existing commute. Dr. Winters asked, with a specific, deliberate carefulness I noticed even in the moment, what time his sessions were scheduled. I told her, and I watched something move across her face that I would later come to understand, with considerable hindsight, as a professional and deeply personal reckoning she was working through in real time, sitting across from me, unable to say what she was actually thinking. I want to describe the specific, disorienting sensation of leaving that session feeling that something significant had happened without being able to name exactly what. I drove home turning the entire exchange over in my mind, understanding, on some level I hadn't fully articulated yet, that Dr. Winters knew something about my own marriage that she was professionally, ethically prevented from simply telling me directly. I called my sister, Priya, that same evening, describing the exchange as best I could, and I remember her going quiet on the other end of the line before finally saying something that reshaped how I approached everything that followed. "That's not an ordinary therapist reaction," she said. "Something specific happened in that room. You need to think carefully about what you actually know, rather than waiting for her to eventually tell you something she legally, professionally can't." I want to explain the specific, methodical process I moved through over the following 2 weeks, because I understood, with a clarity that surprised me given how disorienting the entire situation felt, that I needed to gather information independently rather than waiting for Dr. Winters to somehow resolve this for me. I began paying considerably closer attention to the specific details of Callum's individual therapy schedule, noticing, for the first time with any real scrutiny, that his appointments always fell precisely 30 minutes after mine ended, an overlap I'd never previously thought to question, assuming, without examining it, that this was simply a scheduling coincidence born of shared convenience. I drove to the office building myself one Thursday afternoon, arriving roughly 20 minutes before Callum's scheduled session, parking across the street where I had a clear view of the building's shared entrance. I want to be honest that I didn't fully know, sitting in that car, exactly what I expected to discover, only that some persistent, low-grade unease, the specific hypervigilance I'd later learn is an entirely predictable response to sensing a threat your conscious mind hasn't yet fully named, had been building in me for weeks, keeping me from sleeping properly, making me flinch every time my own phone buzzed unexpectedly. Callum arrived precisely on time, parking his car and walking into the building alone, exactly as I'd expected. What I hadn't expected was the woman who arrived roughly 10 minutes later, walking into that same building, glancing at her phone in a way that suggested she, too, was checking the time for an appointment. I didn't recognize her immediately. I want to describe the specific, strange calm that settled over me watching her walk through that door, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost clinical given the magnitude of what I was beginning to suspect, that I needed to understand considerably more before I allowed myself any emotional reaction at all. I want to explain what I did over the following week, because it required a specific discipline I genuinely wasn't certain, sitting in that car outside the therapist's office, I actually possessed. I didn't confront Callum. I didn't call Dr. Winters demanding an explanation she couldn't ethically provide anyway. Instead, I returned to that same parking spot the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, watching a pattern confirm itself with a consistency that eventually left no room for alternative explanation. The same woman, arriving roughly 10 minutes after Callum, walking into the same building, at the same time, week after week. I finally followed her on the third week, staying at a careful distance as she left the building following her own session, watching her get into a car with a distinctive vanity plate I photographed discreetly from my own vehicle. Running that plate through a public records search that evening, I found her name, Delphine Castillo, 34, an interior designer with an office roughly across town. I sat with that name for a long time that evening, understanding that I now had a specific person to attach to a suspicion I'd been carrying, unnamed, for weeks. I want to describe the specific, complicated decision I made next, because it shaped everything that followed. I didn't reach out to Delphine directly, not yet, understanding that I needed a considerably more complete picture before I did anything that might alert either her or Callum to what I'd already discovered. Instead, I hired a private investigator, a careful, unhurried man named Otis Renwick, recommended by a colleague who'd used his services during her own difficult divorce years earlier. I gave him what I had, the schedule pattern, Delphine's name and license plate, and asked him to establish, definitively, the actual nature of whatever relationship existed between her and my husband. Otis's investigation, conducted carefully over the following 3 weeks, confirmed considerably more than I had initially braced myself for. Callum and Delphine had been involved for just over a year, their relationship beginning, according to records Otis eventually traced, roughly 2 months before Callum had ever suggested we start couples therapy in the first place. I sat with that specific timeline for a long time once Otis presented it to me, understanding, with a growing, sickening clarity, that Callum's suggestion we seek therapy hadn't been born of genuine concern for our marriage at all. It had likely been, at least in part, a way of managing his own guilt, or perhaps simply a convenient cover, one that had, through a coincidence neither he nor Delphine could possibly have anticipated, placed his mistress in individual therapy in the exact same building, working through her own relationship with him using the exact same therapist's professional orbit, separated from our own sessions by nothing more than a shared wall and a 30-minute gap in scheduling. I want to explain something important here, because I think it matters to understanding exactly what had actually been happening, on Dr. Winters's side of this entire situation, throughout those months. I later learned, once the full picture emerged, that Delphine was not, in fact, Dr. Winters's own individual client. She was seeing one of the other 2 therapists who shared that same converted Victorian building, a woman named Dr. Priscilla Ashby, whose office suite sat directly adjacent to Dr. Winters's own, separated by a wall old enough, and thin enough, that certain specific, repeated phrases, the exact kind of therapeutic language clients often pick up and repeat during their own sessions, had language at home. The exact phrase, "I hear that you're upset, and I want to sit with that instead of reacting to it," was, it turned out, not simply Callum's own personal verbal tic. It was language he had learned, and was apparently using in remarkably similar form, in his own individual sessions on the other side of that shared wall, sessions Dr. Winters had apparently been audible, faintly but recognizably, between the 2 rooms for months. Dr. Winters, I would eventually understand, had begun noticing, entirely by accident, a specific overlap in vocabulary between what she heard bleeding faintly through that shared wall from Dr. Ashby's sessions, and what I myself was describing to her about Callum's own gradually, unwillingly begun to suspect, based on nothing more than an unsettling accumulation of overheard phrases and impossible to ignore timing, belonged to the same man I was describing in my own sessions with her. I want to describe the specific, considerable ethical bind Dr. Winters found herself in, because understanding it changed how I ultimately felt about her role in this entire situation once everything came fully into the light. She could not, under any professional or legal standard, confirm or deny anything about another therapist's client, even one she suspected, based on overheard fragments, might be connected to my own husband. She couldn't ethically tell me what she suspected without violating confidentiality standards that existed for genuinely important reasons, protections I understood, even in my own anger and confusion, weren't designed to protect people like Callum specifically, but to protect the entire therapeutic system's integrity more broadly. What she could do, and ultimately did, once her own professional anguish became difficult to sustain silently, was consult her own clinical supervisor and eventually, carefully, encourage me, through the kind of oblique, careful questioning I'd noticed in our sessions, to pay closer attention to specific details I might otherwise have overlooked, without ever crossing the line into direct disclosure herself. I confronted Callum roughly 5 weeks after that first moment of stillness in Dr. Winters's office, having spent that entire period methodically gathering Otis's complete investigation, understanding I needed the full picture before giving Callum any room to construct a careful, managed explanation. I arranged the conversation for a Saturday morning, at our own kitchen table, deliberately choosing a setting and a time when I knew we'd have hours available rather than a rushed evening squeezed between other obligations. I watched Callum's face when I laid Otis's report on the table between us, watched something in his posture collapse in the specific way I'd come to understand, through months of therapeutic language, as the physical manifestation of someone whose carefully maintained narrative has finally, completely run out of room. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice considerably smaller than I'd heard from him in years. "Long enough to understand you suggested therapy 2 months after you started sleeping with her," I told him, keeping my own voice as level as I could manage given the magnitude of what we were actually discussing. "I need you to explain to me exactly what part of couples counseling you thought you were actually doing, Callum, while your mistress was in individual therapy on the other side of a wall from where I was trying to fix our marriage." He didn't have a genuine answer for that. Over the following hour, he admitted, in halting, uneven pieces, that his affair with Delphine had begun roughly 14 months earlier, and that his suggestion we seek couples therapy had indeed been driven, at least partly, by a specific, uncomfortable guilt he hadn't known how to process any other way, a guilt he'd apparently believed working through generic therapeutic language might somehow help him manage without ever actually confronting the specific choice he was continuing to make, week after week, in that same building. I want to describe something Callum said during that conversation that has stayed with me since, because it clarified, more than almost anything else, the specific difference between what I now understood to be genuine remorse and what he was actually offering me instead. "I never meant for you to find out this way," he said, and I remember understanding, hearing that sentence, that it wasn't actually an apology at all. It was regret, the specific, narrower emotion of being sorry the discovery had happened in this particular manner, rather than remorse for the actual, sustained choice to deceive me for over a year while I sat in a therapist's office trying, with genuine sincerity, to save something he had already, quietly, begun dismantling. I want to explain what happened over the following several weeks, because the fallout extended considerably beyond our own marriage, into professional and ethical territory neither Callum nor Delphine had anticipated. I contacted Dr. Winters directly once Otis's investigation was complete, understanding, at that point, that I needed to inform her officially of what I discovered, partly to protect my own therapeutic process going forward, and partly because I genuinely believed she deserved to know the actual shape of a situation she'd clearly been struggling with privately for weeks. Dr. Winters, once I laid out the full timeline for her, was visibly, professionally shaken in a way I hadn't previously seen from her across our entire therapeutic relationship. She explained, carefully, that she had indeed begun suspecting a connection weeks earlier, based on overheard fragments and impossible coincidences of timing, and that she had consulted her own clinical supervisor precisely because the ethical bind she found herself in, unable to disclose anything definitively without violating professional standards, had become entangled, however unintentionally, in a situation that made continued treatment genuinely complicated for both of us. I want to describe what happened with Dr. Ashby's own practice, because it added an unexpected layer to this entire situation that I hadn't anticipated. Once the full picture became clear, Dr. Ashby, upon learning through her own professional channels exactly what had happened, made the difficult decision to terminate her therapeutic relationship with Delphine, understanding, correctly, that continuing treatment had become ethically untenable given everything that had emerged. The specific irony of that decision, that Delphine's own therapy, work she'd presumably undertaken believing it was helping her, had itself been quietly contaminated by exactly the same relationship she may or may not have been honestly discussing in those sessions, struck me, learning about it secondhand, as its own particular kind of quiet justice. I retained an attorney, a careful, direct woman named Marguerite Okonkwo, roughly 2 weeks after my confrontation with Callum, understanding that our marriage's financial entanglements, built over 9 years together, would require considerably more careful unwinding than the emotional reckoning alone. What Marguerite's own investigation eventually revealed, working alongside forensic accounting support, was that Callum had been financially supporting Delphine for months, funneling money through what he described to me as increased consulting expenses, funds that had actually gone toward her rent, a considerable jewelry purchase, and, disturbingly, a portion of the very therapy sessions he'd been attending in that same building, sessions I had, unknowingly, been partly funding through our joint accounts while believing we were investing together in saving our marriage. I want to describe the specific, complicated grief of understanding exactly what those months of genuine therapeutic work had actually cost me, beyond the obvious emotional devastation of the affair itself. I had believed, with total sincerity, that Callum's engagement with therapy, his adoption of new language, his apparent willingness to sit with difficult emotions rather than deflecting them, represented real, if difficult, progress in our marriage. I understand now, with considerable hindsight, that what I'd actually been witnessing was a man who had genuinely learned therapeutic vocabulary, just not for the purpose I'd believed. He'd learned to sound like someone doing the work of change while continuing, week after week, in a room 30 feet away, to make the exact same choice that had necessitated that work in the first place. The divorce proceedings that followed took nearly 7 months to fully resolve, complicated by the financial entanglement Marguerite's team had uncovered, and I received, ultimately, a settlement that reflected both the standard division of marital assets and additional compensation for the funds Callum had diverted, without my knowledge or consent, to support his relationship with Delphine. I did not pursue any formal complaint against either therapist, understanding, once I'd had time to fully process the ethical complexities involved, that Dr. Winters in particular had navigated a genuinely impossible situation with more integrity than I initially, in the raw immediacy of discovery, gave her credit for. I want to explain what eventually happened with Delphine, because I think it matters to give a complete account of this entire situation rather than ending simply on the note of my own legal resolution. I never confronted her directly, understanding, once I'd processed my own anger sufficiently, that whatever role she'd played in this, she too had apparently believed, at least partially, some version of events Callum had constructed specifically to manage two separate relationships without either woman fully understanding the complete shape of what was actually happening. I learned secondhand, roughly a year later, that her own relationship with Callum hadn't survived the transition from secret to public scrutiny, a pattern I'd come to understand, through everything I'd read during those difficult months about betrayal and its aftermath, was considerably more common than the fantasy of the affair partner winning, the relationship that popular culture often suggests. I began seeing a new individual therapist roughly 2 months after my confrontation with Callum, a careful, grounded man named Dr. Elias Farrow who specialized specifically in betrayal trauma, a term I'd first encountered, with a certain bitter irony, in Dr. Winters's own office months earlier, before I understood exactly how personally relevant it would eventually become. Dr. Farrow helped me understand, over the following year of work together, something I found genuinely clarifying amid everything else I was processing. The specific, disorienting quality of what I'd experienced, the hypervigilance, the intrusive replaying of memories now recontextualized by new information, the exhausting compulsion to check and recheck evidence even once I had more than enough to fully understand what had happened, wasn't a sign of instability or excessive suspicion. It was, he explained, an entirely predictable neurological response to having the fundamental safety of my closest relationship revealed as false, a specific kind of injury that required its own particular kind of patient, structured healing rather than simply willpower or time alone. I want to describe, honestly, how difficult that following year genuinely was, because I think it matters to give a complete, truthful account rather than presenting some falsely tidy resolution. I struggled considerably with trusting my own judgment, understanding that I had spent months sitting across from a man using genuine, apparently sincere therapeutic language while simultaneously deceiving me in the same physical building where that language was supposed to be helping us heal together. Dr. Farrow helped me understand the difference, over many careful sessions, between regret and remorse, a distinction that became, for me, considerably more than an abstract therapeutic concept. Regret, he explained, is being sorry you got caught, sorry the story ended this particular way. Remorse is being sorry for the actual pain caused, demonstrated not through words but through sustained, verifiable, uncomfortable accountability. Callum, throughout our entire, painful unwinding, had offered me considerable regret. I never once, in any of our difficult final conversations, received anything I could genuinely call remorse. I think often, still, about that specific moment in Dr. Winters's office, watching her face go still over a single, ordinary sentence I hadn't known carried any particular weight. I think about how close I came to never fully understanding what that stillness actually meant, if I hadn't happened to mention the specific timing of Callum's individual sessions, if she hadn't, within the narrow bounds of what she could ethically do, found a way to encourage me toward paying closer attention. I understand, with real clarity now, considerable distance from that initial discovery, that whatever truth I eventually uncovered existed specifically because I trusted a small, persistent unease rather than simply accepting that a building with thin walls and unfortunate scheduling was nothing more than an unremarkable coincidence. I moved into a small apartment of my own roughly 8 months after that first moment of stillness, a space with walls I never once had to wonder about, and I want to describe the specific, quiet relief of that first night alone, understanding that whatever came next in my own life would happen in rooms that belonged, completely and simply, to me. I've continued my work with Dr. Farrow, understanding that healing from this specific kind of foundational betrayal isn't a single event but a sustained, ongoing practice, the kind of thing that doesn't resolve itself neatly the moment legal proceedings conclude, but that becomes, slowly and with considerable deliberate effort, something I carry rather than something that carries me. If you've made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've turned over often in the time since that specific, unsettling moment in a therapist's office. If your own therapist's face changed, suddenly and unmistakably, in response to something you said without any obvious explanation, would you have pushed immediately for answers you understood she couldn't ethically give you, or would you have done what I did, quietly gathering your own evidence first, trusting the unease rather than demanding an explanation from the one person professionally bound to withhold it? Tell me exactly where you're watching from tonight, and if this story reached something real in you, subscribe, because there are more stories like mine waiting here every day.